this person had already made threats that he was going to kill somebody, he was going to kill a police officer.
Tonight on Let It Rip, 2 different encounters with police officers and 2 lives lost. Both of those killed had knives, but the cops used their guns. And yet, in another incident caught on camera, an angry man with a knife is confronted by police who used a taser instead of bullets. Should this be the new policy for all police departments? Plus, a victory for same-sex couples in the state of Michigan after a judge strikes down a law that denies them benefits. It's not a go-ahead for gay marriage, but some believe it is a start. Time to let it rip. On the panel tonight, he leads a department of nearly 80 men and women sworn to protect and serve the people of Royal Oak. And some of those officers were recently involved in a dangerous confrontation. Corgan O'Donoghue, the police chief of Royal Oak, is here tonight. Next to him, a man who performed those same duties for the city of Detroit. Ralph Godby was only 19 when he first put on the badge before he retired as chief of police in 2012. And the activist next to him has been working even longer to end what he calls excessive force by the people in uniform. Ron Scott leads the Coalition Against Police Brutality. Also with us, a retired police officer who spent years patrolling the streets of Detroit. David Mulholland says he may have the solution, but it won't be easy and it won't be cheap. And as always, attorney, reporter, anchor Charlie Langton is here. Later, we're going to debate a federal judge's ruling that struck down a state law banning benefits for same-sex couples. But right now, we are talking about life and death.
Drop the knife! Drop the knife, man!
Yeah, just scared 12 or 13, I mean.
Now, this was the scene, 2 a.m. Tuesday morning. Royal Oak, a mentally ill man, armed with a knife, confronting police. They repeatedly told him to drop the knife, but instead, he started walking straight at one of the officers. They again told him to drop the knife, but when he didn't drop that knife, they dropped him with a taser. Within seconds, he was in handcuffs and under arrest, but instead of jail, he was taken to a hospital for a psychological evaluation. Chief Donoghue, this is an extremely dangerous situation for everyone involved, but in this case, no one died. Is that the policy in Royal Oak?
Well, I wouldn't refer to it as a policy. First, I'd like to start off, I'd like to commend the officers. They did a great job. They worked as a team, and this scenario had the best possible ending I think we could hope for. The officers, like I said, they did a great job. Our policy in any kind of dealing with the mental health issue is you try to de-escalate it. A lot of times for police officers, though, they don't know what they're getting into as they pull up.
Well, actually, apparently this man's mother called police later to tell them that he actually wanted to commit suicide by cop. He wanted to be killed that night. Yeah. But there's no way for you to tell that when you confront it.
Correct. The only information the officers at the scene had is there's a man in the middle of the intersection with a knife.
And they did not use their guns, but instead used tasers. Meanwhile, though, Ralph Godby, in Ann Arbor, a few days ago, a 40-year-old woman with a knife is shot and killed by police. It was a domestic violence situation. Could you please explain to me why a 40-year-old woman with a knife should be shot and killed?
Well, there's something called the reactionary gap, and officers are trained to a standard, especially when someone has an edged weapon, and that gap is considered to be 20 to 25 feet. But when you go into a domestic violence situation, those are sometimes some of the most violent, volatile, unknown situation that you're going into. So it really depends on the department's training, the standard you're trained to, but what type of tools are they provided? So not knowing whether the Ann Arbor officers had access to rubber bullets, did they have tasers, that would have a big impact on what decision was made in that fateful time when that woman was shot. And I wanted to tell the viewers here on Let It Rip, we're not here to point fingers. We're not here to blame the police for every death, but we're here to try to understand why things happen in certain situations. Ron Scott, also a 27-year-old man, Sunday, apparently suffering from some sort of syndrome that made him have the mental capacity of an 8-year-old child. He's running around in his pajamas with a knife. Police are called. They tell him to drop the knife. He raises the knife and is shot and killed.
Well, once again, like I said, none of us were there, so we don't know the scenario. But I do know, in fact, it was interesting that we worked with Chief Godby some time ago in terms of response to individuals who were mentally challenged, and that didn't go where we wanted it to go in the city of Detroit, so that officers understand how to de-escalate situations, how to identify psychological issues, like the chief was talking about in Royal Oak, how to identify that so that they can act to minimize the danger for all parties concerned. So it went further than, if it happened as they say it did, further than it should have. I reached out to the mother today, and she was concerned about that because she had notified police that he was, in fact, not developmentally disabled.
Yeah. David, here's the problem. Let's be real here. Police kill about 400 civilians a year in confrontations. And I'm not saying whether they're justified or unjustified, but 400 civilians die each and every year. So how do we change it? How do we stop it?
Well, you do better training. You learn self-defensive tactics. You learn force reduction training, where you learn to identify the situation and then how to de-escalate.
Did you get that training in Detroit?
We did years ago. I don't know what the current training is. I hope it's better than what we had. The problem we had in Detroit, it wasn't reinforced year after year or even 6 months after. Like, we had defensive tactics in the academy, but then we were released to the streets and we never had refresher courses. So officers, especially when you get armed with a taser and a gun, you've got 2 guns on your hip, and you're kind of forced into a situation where you got to make decisions, and if you don't know how to de-escalate or how to identify it, then you got to pull out one weapon or the other, and that's a fatal decision. It could be fatal with a taser. One of the objections I had to a taser was that if you have heart problems or you're frail health, that taser shot could be a deadly shot, as if I put a bullet in you. Now, if you hit me with a taser, I'm a little bigger, but you hit Ron, he's a little thinner, there may be a different outcome. But I had a triple heart bypass, so
you
it
might
may
be in great
deadly
danger
to me. So it's up to the officers to be properly trained, to assess the situation, and to react to that situation, trying to bring it down and trying to not use fatal force or even taser force.
If they can avoid it. Meanwhile, Charlie, every family involved has hired a lawyer.
Well, of course they have, and yes, and if the officer goes beyond what she is trained to do, there will be a lawsuit. But it wasn't all that long ago the city of Detroit entered into a consent agreement with the Department of Justice, in part because of police overdoing what they were supposed to be doing the right way. I like the idea that police have the option, because I believe our police officers know what the option is, a taser or a gun. And they should have that option. With an officer only having a gun, there's no option there.
Do Detroit police have that option?
No.
They only have guns.
They only have guns right now, but I do believe that Chief Craig is piloting with certain units the taser. And we have to really look at the fact that tasers are, first of all, the term is less than lethal force. There's always the risk that someone can die. If you use a baton, there's a risk someone could die. With hard hands, there's a risk someone could die. There's a phenomenon called excited delirium when someone's high off drugs, so they can have a heart attack. The risk is always there, but the job for us is to mitigate that risk. We've got to be more honest. We've got to deal with our community. We have to deal with places like NAMI with mental health issues, because recognition is so important. If you have someone with a psychotic episode and an officer is yelling at them, it confuses them. They don't know to drop the weapon. Now you've exacerbated the situation.
Well, let me ask both of you, why aren't officers trained to wound instead of kill?
Well, that's not, it's not really practical. What I would point out is, you mentioned the amount of officers who, civilians were killed by officers. Every study I've seen, and in my career I've seen it, officers are extremely reluctant to use lethal force. There's been multiple, if there's 400 people that were shot, there's been thousands and tens of thousands of scenarios where an officer might have been justified, but they're reluctant to do it. I agree, you have to give officers an option for dealing with these mental health issues. The problem is I could have a psychiatrist in the car with me. You can't make an on-the-spot evaluation in a couple of seconds. And, you know, these officers, in the Royal Oak situation, we had a lot of things going for us. It was an open street. It's a lot different when you go to a house because we're called there for a crisis. You open the door and you've got to deal with whatever's in front of you. And, you know, the other two situations are unfortunate. I'm sure they'll be reviewed and looked into and to see if the officers acted properly. But there's not an easy answer. I think there's a societal issue with these mental health issues. But the police officer on the street making that on-the-spot decision, he has to be trained. He has to be given an option. But with any potentially lethal force situation, the less lethal is a secondary option. We have what's called a contact and cover officer. So during this scenario, we had an officer who drew down on him. If the taser didn't work, that would have been an option for us, you know.
But at least the gun was not the first choice, right?
I just want to say a taser is a neuromuscular interrupted device. I mean, it is essentially a small cattle prod. I mean, that's what it amounts to. So, and in fact, Taser International, in terms of product liability, has been taken to court a couple of times. It was dismissed on summary judgment. But nonetheless, they, based on an incident that happened with the RCMP in Canada, now have to use the tasers below the waist, because essentially when you do it above the waist, you can in fact cause death. We have a very famous case here in Detroit where that happened to a 16-year-old. So essentially less than lethal, I think Ralph said it, less than lethal and de-escalation and community relations. Chief has not reached out to us.
If you have the time, and in the split seconds it takes to confront somebody, I'm not sure any officer, anybody on this panel would have the time of the judgment. So maybe, hopefully, that finding the money to arm all officers with tasers, giving them the option, the choice, to use less than lethal force.
Weaponry, not necessarily just tasers. Don't do a commercial for Taser International.
And possibly wound instead of kill.
But we need more mental health hospitals.
We do.
Going way back to Governor Engler closing down, he made Detroit police officers taxi cab drivers for the mentally ill. Families would call us, they're off their meds.
And they're still out there.
He's dangerous. Get him out of the house. And yet the person was not dangerous. He wasn't psychotic.
But the family couldn't control him either, and that's why they called him.
The family could control him.
It's an issue, the bigger issue we're going to deal with.
You know,
that's for sure.
It's a difficult issue, but we thank you for addressing it, panel. Appreciate your comments and your insights. Up next, a federal judge weighs in on a law that treated same-sex couples differently in this state. So what does it mean for marriage in Michigan? It's all next when Let It Rip returns.
See? Thank you.